Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Shameen Sandhu, and we're here today at the Partners and Caregivers as Parents and Caregivers as Partners conference for the presentation that I'll be doing. And I'll talk about that in one moment. I just wanted to introduce myself and just let everybody also know that my presenter, unfortunately, is not going to be able to be here today. Adolph Williams. He just had a family situation come up, all is well. And so I'll be here by myself today. And I'm Shameen Sandhu, and I work for the Toronto District School Board as the system leader for mental health and professional support services. So again, I really thank you all for being here today. And what we're going to be talking about for the next 40 minutes or so in a discussion is something that has come up in the last little bit when we've looked at mental health for young people that we work with at the Toronto District School Board, and how the scaffolding around racial trauma translates into even the outdoors, and what that means for our teachers and our educators and all of us staff who work with students. And we're going to touch on a few nuggets today. It is a short presentation. It's about 45 minutes. So my hope is after this that a few things that you find interesting, that you take away with, maybe a few points, and maybe some discussion pieces for your school spaces that your students or children might be attending, and also for us to just be reflective of when we think about racism, where that translates into. Before we start, and this is quite poignant when we're talking about the outdoor space and the land that we settle on, but we do want to do the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge we are hosted on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. We also recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. And this presentation, again, will touch on some elements of settler colonialism, as well as understanding the pieces of decolonizing our outdoors. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. What I wanted to first start with, as we think about racism and we think about the impact on mental health. In the role that I'm in, I have the fortune to work with two wonderful people who are mental health leads, who are here today, also supporting Amani and Annette. And we talk often about this conversation around mental health and wellness tends to negate the impact racism and other pieces of oppression have on our wellness. So one of the things that I just want us all to keep in mind as we talk and discuss this through the next 40 minutes is understanding on our end the need to make sure we unlearn histories that we've learned that don't represent the true voices and histories of Indigenous peoples, racialized peoples, Black, and as well as communities that have the intersectionalities of gender expression through all the building that they have done for the communities in and around and our outdoor spaces. And while we're doing that and we're looking at those pieces of trauma and pain, we also want to keep really aligned with that are the joys and the triumphs and the assets and the brilliance and the beauty of how our outdoor spaces have been curated and constantly defined and accessed and prepared and created by, again, Indigenous, Black, and racialized groups, and again with intersectionalities of different gender expression and abilities within that. I don't want this presentation to be a sole concentration on what is traumatic about it. I want us to be able to see when we're working with young people what they also bring into these spaces in the outdoors at TDSB, whether it's any other school board, when we take them into the outdoor spaces and the outdoor learnings that we do in many of the environments and programs that we have in our school spaces. We know when we talk about mental health and we think about how race, for example, is one of those oppressive pieces that has such an impact on how we feel about ourselves and what chronic stress and trauma look like, we also know that our well-being is intersected by many, many different pieces of our social identities. And what we're going to be talking a little bit more and concentrating on today is just the impact of the environment around us. And that does include the cultural pieces, and that does include the systemic pieces, as well as the personal individual pieces of how we take in the racialized trauma that we experience. As a brown identifying woman who has first generation born and settled on this land with parents who settled back in the 80s. It's been quite a journey for me to recognize my positionality in relation to race, racism, anti-Black racism, and indigeneity. The impact that colonization has had in my community with respect to shadeism, and how that's translated into my experiences, as well as experiences of other people in and around me in education, as well as how I have experienced working with communities and young people and parents and guardians who have different lived experiences than I have in these school spaces as a social worker. So the question I ask, and this is something we've been asking our outdoor education teachers and staff who work there, is the environment neutral for everybody? And this question came up actually out of a small, quick, brief presentation that I had done with the outdoor staff at the Toronto District School Board, where somebody had stated in their feedback that they were confused as to why we're talking about race and why we're talking about the outdoors, because they felt the outdoors were open to everybody and was a neutral space. And I thought that was a really interesting question, and I started reflecting on it, and I spoke to people at work about it and my counterparts about it, and we thought as we move forward and build the capacity of understanding how racism is deeply embedded in our institutions, including how we experience the outdoors, that having that question as the guiding part of really reflecting on, is the space around us outside of our institutions and our walls actually neutral for everybody? Now, I am going to leave this video, and I was going to play it. It is a 4-minute video, but just in the sense of time, I want to just get through the presentation. If we have a little bit of time, I'll play it, but I'll make sure I send it over to the the coordinators for this conference, and you can see it yourself. The video does a really nice job. It is an American video, but talking about the intersectionalities of mental health and the impact that mental health has on young people who have that experience racism and the chronic impact of that. And I want us to keep that in mind as we talk about the next couple of things. So when we think about racialized trauma, a lot of discussion has been going on for some years now at TDSB, in particular trauma-informed practices. And we've had really critical, reflective thoughts and ideas about what does that mean when we tell somebody that, or we feel somebody's been traumatized. And when we do that, how are we experiencing them? And when I ask that question, I want you to just keep in mind again what we spoke about right in the beginning about acknowledging trauma and learning, but also at the same time acknowledging the brilliance and the joy and the hope that many, many communities who are non-white bring into our school spaces as well as out there. The one interesting piece that we must sort of understand quite well is that racialized trauma is very, it's inherent, it's generational, it happens to us on individual levels, it happens to us on systemic levels. There's vicarious trauma. When we see, and I'll give one quick example of the Black folks that were murdered in Buffalo, our Center of Excellence for Black Student Achievement staff who were asked to respond with some resources for our school board felt very impacted by having to do that and having to support our schools, our school communities, while they themselves really saw the people that had been murdered were reflections of who they were. And that vicarious trauma of things that you hear and see around you, stories that you've heard from your grandparents, from your parents, from your uncles and aunts, stories that you hear from your communities, these things are heavy. And they also do something else, which we'll talk about in a second, but they're heavy pieces that we all carry with us, and all in different ways, because the impact of racial trauma is so different on the continuum of shadeism also. And that's a totally different presentation, but just to keep that in mind. And then the pieces that are transmitted, again, through generationally, but also this constant, these constant experiences that allow our young racialized children and youth who learn to navigate systems such as education in a way of the learnings that they've had from their parents. One of the most common ones to that are the pieces around Black parents who tell their children, for example, their boys, about how to act in front of police authority, how to behave, because some of those interactions can result in life or death. And those sorts of conversations heighten a response that really you carry with you genetically in a traumatic way as you experience different situations and newness, or also as you navigate systems. We also, I don't want to take away from the fact that part of racial trauma also includes the intersectionalities of other pieces that can be part of your social identities. So there are many social identities somebody has, and we don't experience spaces in the same way, even if we may come from the same community or the same racial community. And having that mindfulness as teachers and as support staff who support young people outside in our outdoor education is really important too, of how they experience it. When we look at what are the pieces that really have an impact on persistently maintaining these feelings that can arise from the already individual, systemic, and intergenerational traumatic stories and events and situations that can occur, are the ongoing pieces of this cloud that can sometimes sit on young people when you feel like nothing you do is enough, when you can't feel like you're yourself in an environment. And I bring this image up only because one of the experiences that I was fortunate enough to have is at working as a social worker in one of our expulsion programs. We had an opportunity to take 7 young male adolescent Black identifying boys to one of our outdoor centers for 3 days. And many of the young men initially were not that keen to go. They didn't quite understand what they would be doing there. They felt there'd be a high degree of boredom in that environment. And we were able to, through relationship building that we had created, get enough excitement going where they did come. And many of them, myself included, didn't grow up camping or being in the outdoors much either. We sort of experienced things, some newness in similar types of ways. And some of those pieces were around clothing, where there was this set idea of what type of clothing you have to have, when a lot of the clothing they already had was sufficient for being in the outdoors at the time of year that we were in. And so these extra pressures that we put on about what somebody has to look like in those outdoor spaces really, again, can erase some of our the ways our racialized and other communities that are non-white can feel excluded in the outdoor spaces. There was nothing that these young boys didn't bring to wear, or the shoes that they had that would have required them to change and buy something else that they would not have worn. So even the staff at the outdoor space had to kind of open up their minds a bit about what that meant. What we found so beautiful was that we went for a a long, mild hike walk. And as we were walking, we came across a river that I couldn't tell you the name of it, but it was maybe a creek, but the water was going quite rapidly. And I remember we just sat there and there was silence for probably a good 10-15 minutes of just taking in the sounds of nature. And part of what the young students said to us, the young males in this case, and even for myself, I don't experience that often living in the city and having grown up in the city, and even on the periphery of the city, whether it's like kind of Scarborough or, North York or what used to be North York and, the west end of Toronto, whereas where I grew up, I didn't hear the silence as much as we did that day. And that was something that was really profound to a lot of, to all the young men that we were with, who just said they had never sat somewhere that silent and just heard birds and the creak of the water just going and seeing the beauty of nature. And part of that sort of experience as we went through the 3 days was those pieces around what's here is feeling valued, seeing themselves in that space, not feeling like because they didn't bring the right clothing, they weren't able to experience something, but really opening up those places of space that allow people who don't have a rigid way of looking at what the outdoor people have to look like to be able to experience it. So when we talk about pieces about what we're seeing in respect to the impact that racialization and that constant trauma that happens every single day, however young people are experiencing it in our schools, it is visceral. And I know some of you can probably really talk and have many stories to talk about when you actually feel it, even if it's not directly impacted you because you're part of that community. And that this transmission generationally has a huge impact on how do you heal? How do you see yourself being supported? And we're part of that healing circle at a school space. And that is one of the things we're really supporting heavily is that in order for us to understand other people, we have to be able to sit back, listen, and cushion the people around us. And part of that is increasing your circle of care. The practices of healing don't always have to be what we traditionally thought that they look like. They can be part of communities that give us new ways of doing and being. Such as through song, touch, movement, and breath. And one of the most beautiful things that I recall that happened out of that experience that I had with going up to that outdoor space with those 7 young men was that 2 of them had actually were really big into writing spoken word poetry and wrote a significant amount of stuff around that experience that they had because what they had seen and it was a rainy time too. So I remember it was really muddy, the mud that they remember feeling, but mud that they had never seen before because it was thicker mud, it was deeper mud. And hearing different types of bird chirps that we all hadn't experienced before were part of listening to these songs and the spoken word poetry that they were writing. And it was really beautiful to see me learn about what they learned through their voice in the different mediums that they were choosing to do that in. So when we look at feelings that we feel around mental health and wellness, and as Resmaa Menakem says in his book, which is amazing, My Grandmother's Voice, I think it is, I goes, while we see anger and violence in the streets, the real battlefield is in our bodies. And that conflict needs to be resolved. And again, as educators and as people in the education system working with young people, we're part of that solution, and we have to be part of that solution. So one of the parts that I think is really important, and I just want to highlight that with this presentation, is that trauma-informed practices are definitely extremely relevant and extremely important for us to have our practices aligned with it. Although One of the pieces that we are really moving towards is not concentrating on just what has harmed the person, acknowledging it, finding out the truth and hearing about it and doing our learnings on it, definitely. But we also want our system to be able to see young people and children for what is right about them. So when we initially learned about trauma informed practices, instead of asking this child or the youth, what is wrong with you when whatever their behaviors were looking like, the trauma informed lens tells you, well, what has happened to you? And that's that learning of the stories. Where are you at? How am I complicit in what has happened to you? And how can I, in the power relationship and the power pieces I have, be able to support a better, more an identity affirming environment for you, so that you can really foster and see the beauty that you bring into that space. The healing piece is, well, what is right about you? What are the assets, and how are we going to elevate those pieces as we speak about young people, especially as they experience the outdoors, which is what we want more and more of our young people to be able to do and participate in. So these are beautiful pictures that some of our students have drawn, but what we're looking at is a continuum between trauma and healing. And we really want our supports to be part of the healing process. So when we see trauma informed, it's around coping. Healing informed and is around restorative stuff. It's about bringing back, about reimagining, rehoping, rebelieving. It looks at the root causes of what has happened to you for sure, but also, again, what is so wonderful about you, that we're really bridging and building and reliefing those sides that our institutions and our social spaces don't see sometimes because of the biases and assumptions, especially the negative biases and assumptions in the single story narratives about Black, Indigenous, and racialized children and youth. I just wanted to play this one piece. Dr. Sean Ginwright is the person that we're really using heavily. He's American doctor who has a PhD, who has done a lot of work around healing engagement. And although I don't want to speak about his story, one of the stories that he speaks of in one of his YouTube videos and TED Talks, I believe, is where he sort of had this epiphany, for a better word, that I can't really think of right now, when he was working with young racialized males, mostly Black identifying, who had experiences with the criminal justice system, and they were talking about trauma and why they're there, and unpacking maybe some of the decisions that they feel like they don't have opportunity, and how to kind of cope in that. And one of the young male stood up and asked Dr. Ginseng, why are we constantly talking about what is wrong in my life and what's wrong with me? And he goes, I really want to talk about what I love and what I want to do and what I aspire to do and what I hope to do. And Dr. Ginseng says he had to sit back for a second and think, here we are constantly talking about what isn't right. And there's many actions that are not happening as fast as they should. The transformational changes are not going in the way that we would. So we don't want to get away from understanding the history of what is happening to our young people. But we're also at the same time have to align what is really going well. How are these young people, what are their hopes, and how are we building those pieces up as we're still learning about what has happened to them and what is continually to happen to them. I'm just looking at time, and I am going to play this. If you can give me one moment, because I do have to get out of here and redo. Just 1 second. Give me 1 moment. So sorry.
what are the practices that build hope and healing and equity in our schools and community organizations, right? And there are just 4. The first practice is build practice that supports your own healing and well-being. And that sounds radical, that sounds crazy, right? We're thinking about young people. But if we're not well, young people can't be well. So how are we thinking about having healing circles in our work? I always say that I don't do professional development, I do personal transformation, right? Because we're human in this work, and it affects us as well. The second is to create opportunities to build loving, courageous relationships with young people. We also have to build loving, courageous relationships with ourselves. How do we relate to one another, right? What do we use in our professional development seminars and practices that actually build relationships? The third is to create healing circles that are focused on healing, not conversation circles, right? In the workshop, I suggested that the most powerful thing we can do with young people is to simply tell our story in an honest way, right? To tell our story so that our humanity shows up and not our professional degree, right? When we tell our story in an honest way, it gives young people the permission to do the same. And it establishes a relationship that we can remember and can be leveraged into kind of behaviors that we want to see from young people. And then the fourth is support young people with creating justice in their communities. That young people can see the inequality. Young people can see how there's an inequality in how terms of resources are spent. And our goal sometimes is to support young people with reimagining their communities and support them with creating options and opportunities to create the kind of communities they want to see. I'd like to end with this quote from Dr. King. And he says that one of the greatest problems of history is that the concepts of love and power have usually been contrasted as opposites. And what is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice. And justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. Go love our children. Thank you.
You created a business. Now,
So as Dr. Jin Wright, was saying, I'm thinking about singing. Jin Wright was speaking of that piece, that quote that he uses about power and love. And we see, like, again, trauma and joy on these different spectrums, but they're really on the same. And as people who are working with young people, we have to be able to do both at the same time. And that is absolutely possible. Just simply on the story that I gave you from many years ago of how those young people experience nature, when I would say all of them, except for maybe one, was not excited about going. So I ask the question again, is our environment neutral for us? When I think about our environment and I think about we have young people in school spaces, we have young people who experience outside educational spaces, how do we affirm their dignity? And we don't speak, I feel, enough in our world around, in our educational world, around dignity and the dignity of young people, the rights that they have to be able to be heard, to be seen, to feel that they matter in those spaces. And many of us often speak about belonging, and that is definitely something that is very, very crucial. In the world that I see, I really emphasize this idea of mattering. What does it mean to actually feel like you're in a space, whether you're inside or outside, but you are so essential to that experience that if you weren't there, that everybody else wouldn't be learning in the same way, and that you understand that how connected you are to that group, to that learning, and you're essential to it. And many of our young racialized students don't feel that way. often they feel disconnected. And those are the pieces that are so important to implement. And we'll talk a little bit about those strategies in a couple of minutes. But I really wanted to have us think about, how do we affirm dignity and identities, not just identity, but identities of young people in the spaces that we work with them and on power and love. Now, our outdoor spaces, when we're talking about truth and understanding what we know, again, Menakem, which is my grandmother's hands, as well as Carolyn Finney, who is American, they've written some really amazing oral histories and ideas and thoughts about, that come very deeply from their own personal histories, but also from research about what does nature around us, is it neutral? And one of these things that we have to recognize is that the white body is the standard in the outdoors. We see that in paper, in magazine clips of who is hiking, who's in hiking clothes, sometimes who's skiing, all of those pieces in the outdoors, the representation of racialized folks and people with different social identities and different abilities is sometimes quite clearly absent and at times very muted. Also, the constant pressure on the Black and brown bodies to deal with racialized trauma, which we've sort of covered a bit. And then the continual worry of the violence, again, against Black and brown people, which is part of our structural organization of the world that we live in and the land. Carolyn Finney in particular talks about how white supremacy really is in the water, in the air, and everything we breathe and think about. It's in the structure of our society, the media, the religion, the economics. And if Dr. West Burns at OISE, who's somebody who consults heavily with us on anti-racism and anti-Black racism in particular, talks about that metaphor and or takes that metaphor that somebody who's escaping my mind right now writes about, like, we all breathe in the smog. And when you're in it, the complicity is sometimes really hard to see until you're able to step back and reflect and again, listen and hear. And really intentionally and actionably think about dignity and think about what is happening in front of me and how can I support the further inclusion and the mattering of this young person in this space. What we find in a lot of our media stuff, our social media, is the erasure of race in the outdoors, or it's represented in a way that is so negative that it just reaffirms the vicarious trauma of racialization. And again, we talk about even in our current state, with the conversations we have with, in particular, the intersectionality of gender and race with Black and brown boys around their safety, around authorities within the spaces that we're in. So wrong color, wrong place. These pieces are deep in these communities, and that fear and that worry is there. And this is, I've just put a picture of Carolyn Finney's book, which is fantastic. It is American again, but it has a lot of remnants that really resonate even in a Canadian context. So again, she speaks a lot about the dominant narratives around the Western European Eurocentric ways of doing. And what is often left out, and this is where I want to go back to thinking about trauma and joy and healing, because what's left out are the narratives of African Americans, of Black folks, of brown bodies, of racialized bodies, of different social identities. And part of those pieces are that the outdoors historically has been very dangerous, even if we're not looking at our current situation, for Black bodies. In particular, she has this quote that was really powerful, just even reading it, that the assault on African Americans is not by bears, wolves, or other non-human animals, but by white human animals, making the woods and wilderness often feel unsafe for African Americans. Now, with that balancing piece, because we also want to acknowledge the fact that there are many Black and brown folks that have navigated, carved, created, curated, and continually do the environments that we live in on the outdoors. And Dorcetta Taylor really deeply has a passion for the outdoors, and again is American, but she also speaks about it's a fallacy to think that Black Americans or folks from the Black community or other racialized communities actually have not and don't have a good relationship with the environment around us. I came across that single story negative bias in that same example I provided, where a lot of the staff felt that these 7 Black boys would just not like the outdoors. Let's not bother, let's not go there. They're not going to like it because that's not their thing. They're from Toronto, that piece. But the being open for these new experiences in a way, again, that affirms their identity and makes them feel like they matter, really opened up their desire to want to experience it, because they felt that they were accepted in that place with the group of people that they were with. And Dorcetta Taylor talks about the fact that, for example, W.E. Du Bois, his research was an environmental research when he was looking at Black communities, and he was looking at social inequity and justice issues. She talks about Harriet Tubman and the reason the US military used her knowledge to be able to navigate the environment, to be able to do the things that they were able to do without her knowing how the environment and the space worked, they would not have been successful. And that, in slavery, the ecological background was very well noted, and they knew how to experience it. When we look at lands of other countries, whether it's in Asia or whether it's in Africa, countries where farming, land, forestry, all of those pieces are places that we came from. I've just learned in the last some years through my parents' oral histories about how heavy farming and agriculture was in my family that I didn't have any clue about, which they were doing in India. Back in the 18th and 17th centuries. And those pieces are part of who I am. And my ancestors who loved the land and knew the land and appreciated the land and navigated the land fine. So again, I bring it back to when we're looking at trauma and healing, looking at hearing pain, hearing joy, we also want to recognize the fact that we're still in social environments that are extremely oppressive, that continue to impact, again, Indigenous, Black, and racialized bodies. Examples of formalized pieces are things like the head tax, the Exclusion Act, the Indian Act, and still a lot of policies and procedures that continue to be very oppressive. Examples of those pieces are, for example, dumping waste on anything that's not Indigenous land. If you can notice here, the cost is $2,000 to as $100 if you do it on an Indigenous reserve versus $2,000 to $1 million on a non-Indigenous land. And you think about, wow, that these things are still deep. We know about the water, the lack of safe, clean water on Indigenous reserves, all of these pieces, things and the dynamics still happening in places like Toronto for sure, in Ontario for sure, in Nova Scotia for sure, and in particular, Africville, where mercury poisoning has generationally impacted Black folks who lived and grew up there from decades and decades and decades ago. So again, is the environment safe for everybody? These are 4 examples of areas within Ontario, Nova Scotia, that still continue to have a great deal of toxic dumping, where generations of people living there, certain forms of cancer are on a rise, and doesn't just happen again with that generation, it's become generational, where mental health and wellness is very impacted by the impacts of the environment that is not clean and safe for them, but that is their home and that's where they live. So even on a very tangible level, these things are so dangerous for many of the folks that are continuing to experience this. And this is not in the past, this is current. So I don't have the time to play this piece, but I will send it over to Margaret. I really, really love Alex Bailey, who's this young man in the Tennessee area who's passionate about the outdoors and really having young people who are Black, Indigenous, and non-white come out to those experiences and experience it in a way that he has learned to love. And in particular, he speaks a lot about what can we do to make this more viable and something that young racialized youth and children will have a desire to go, and the parents and caregivers feel safe allowing their young children and youth to attend and go to. Because again, going back to racialized trauma, the environment isn't always safe for all of our young racialized youth in the same way. And part of what he speaks about is questioning your own positionality. Myself as a brown female identifying person, how am I impacting this, and what's my power and love in making sure that there's a connectivity and that young person feels like they matter in that environment, that they belong there. How am I decolonizing through discussions and learning new ways of knowing? Part of what we found out in speaking with these young people was who didn't bring the proper shoes or the hiking boots or whatever, was that what they already had was fine for the type of hike we were going to do. And ourselves, more so the people leading the hike, being open to the fact that this doesn't have to be a certain type of shoe or a certain type of being. Looking at not a one size fits only, and that's that whole identity affirming piece of really looking at individual experiences and incorporating that into a circle of care. At TDSB, just as the last bit, what we're really, and what my experience as a social worker has sought out when I'm working with people where we have a slew of differences, but we're trying to figure out how to support each other and also come to find ways to support them, and being mindful of the power that I bring into those spaces, is relationships. And relationships include what Tara Yoso spoke about so eloquently, is looking at our young people and the assets they bring into those spaces, the aspirational capital. Like that young man said to Dr. Ginsing, I'm more than just my trauma. The different types of languages and dialect and vernaculars that they bring, their family history capital, the resistance capital that they've learned, whether through their family histories, their elders, or even from their own experiences of navigating these really difficult systems. The transformational capital, what have they changed? Where have they provided action? Who have they held accountable, and who's helped support them to ensure that they've been able to be present in that moment in a way that's affirming. And the navigational capital, being able to really recognize these pieces that allow us to know that young people matter in those spaces. And mattering means paying attention to them, building their confidence, being aware of my power and positionality, and providing some of that power back to those young people, that their voice matters. When they said, why do I have to wear the hiking boots? I think these running shoes and these kicks are good. They can hike, and they were fine. That they know that their voice in that moment that they were in there was so needed. They were needed in that space because we learned from them, and that we appreciated them being there, and that we loved having them there. And it also requires us to have an understanding of what cultural humility is throughout all of this learning that we're learning, even when we're listening to traumatic stories and learning about the histories and unlearning the histories that we've already learned that were very Eurocentric and did not have the voices of the multitude of different types of people that have come and settled on this land and were already settlers on this land when we came aboard. But it's being aware of our own understanding of history and the complexities of that. It's about continuing that journey, that you're never going to stop. You're on a journey of equity and learning. That being very conscious of the fact, again, of what are my power pieces? Where do I stand in this? And how do I provide that bridging? And finally, just as a piece that with racialized trauma and the outdoors, when we harp on the trauma and we hope that it gets smaller, racialized trauma and how that's experienced in the outdoors isn't going to get smaller. What makes those pieces feel smaller, I say that very strategically, feel smaller, is having that cushioning that gets bigger around that young person, which is our responsibility, all the adults in their life. The more we see them, the more we support them, the more we affirm their identities, the more we make them feel like they matter, their voices are present, the more we have those difficult, critical discussions, the more we hold ourselves accountable in why I can think differently, why I can think outside the box, why I am so attuned to just doing it this way, challenging those pieces in a way that, again, can be so difficult. Those are the things that create those feelings of trauma in a way that doesn't necessarily become smaller, but it becomes farther away from being so close to the surface. So finally, just as the end, because I know we're right there, this is from Alex Bailey, but he says this one piece where he talks about he takes these young Black males out on this hike, and it's night and the stars are shining, and many of them had never, in whatever area they were in the States, had seen a sky with so many stars. And he says, he goes, you are your ancestors' wildest dreams without violent outcomes for standing outside. And it was so profound to them because not all of our racialized communities and groups can do that. So representation is so important. Hiring teachers, hiring staff, hiring support staff, social workers that represent the students that we're working with on various social identities. And also relevancy. And that piece is about acknowledging the triumphs, the joys, the beauty, the brilliance young people bring into spaces while we're still learning about the traumatic histories and unlearning the histories and having those critical conversations and holding our power pieces and our systems and our structures and ourselves accountable for it, elevating those stories of triumph and really doing those pieces around mattering, thinking about whose stories are shared and elevated and whose aren't. And again, pain, joy, knowing that we can have trauma and healing in the same spectrum. We can have pain and joy in the same spectrum, but let's not concentrate and teeter on one or the other, but really try to have this in a way that it affirms the trueness and the authenticity of the young people that we're working with. And I'm going to just stop there because I realize we're at 102. I really know that there's a lot of information here. I was trying to just hit on some few nuggets that I'm hoping have sat with you in some of the work that we're doing at TDSB with teachers and with support staff who work with young people on really making sure that the spaces not only in school, but also outside of school are representing the various identities and supporting that learning and unlearning that we all have to do. So I really thank you all for being here today. And I don't know if we have time for questions or comments. I'm not quite sure how long we have, but if anybody does have any, I'm more than happy to take them. And I'm just going to stop sharing so I can actually see. Okay, wonderful. I see a comment here. Yeah, moving the work environment and climate justice forward in our communities and schools for sure. And really making sure that the people who are, the young people who are represented and feel that they can come from various communities and feel like they can have a voice in that because they definitely have a lot to say. I wish I didn't have time to do that, but I wish I had, because I wasn't able to get permission yet to share some of that spoken word poetry. Two of those young men had written about their first experience of being in a place of not hearing the trucks go by and not hearing the street, but actually really aligning with nature in a way they had never experienced. And it was quite beautiful. So definitely. Oh, that's great. I was reading Don Mills Collegiate has a Black Food Sovereignty Garden, and that's wonderful, and Indigenous food. These are the things that, that's amazing. That is so amazing. And that's the type of work we hope continues and learning. I know David and Mary Thompson has a garden where they're putting in different types of vegetables that are very specific to communities that many students didn't even know existed. And that learning, again, is just so wonderful and beautiful. Well, I Thank you all so much for your time today. I know it's a Saturday and it is a beautiful day outside. And know that we are all on a journey of making sure our young people have that voice and feel that support, while we're also being very conscious of our responsibility and power in making sure those spaces are created. So thank you all so very much. And I wish you all a really great conference. And I hope you have a really great weekend.